get us underway. So it is with enormous pleasure that I introduce the speaker this week, Professor Lucy Henry. So Lucy is a professor of speech and language at City University of London. Her expertise are in the development of memory and higher order thinking, specializing in children with a range of developmental conditions, such as developmental language disorder, intellectual disability, developmental coordination disorder, Down syndrome, Williams syndrome, autism, and maltreatment histories. Lucy previously lectured at developmental psychology at Reading before going to the Institute of Psychiatry, Psychology and Neuroscience at King's, where she trained as a clinical psychologist. She remained there for several years as a Wellcome Research Fellow, specifically looking at witness skills in children with intellectual disabilities. In addition to all of that, Lucy was my director of studies for my PhD research. And also, Lucy today is going to be talking to us about her latest research with adolescents with learning disabilities. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Lucy, and turn my camera and mic off, but I'll jump in if you need me.
Lovely, thank you so much. It's really nice to be here, and thanks so much for inviting me. I've got great pleasure today in telling you about a research project on Hebb repetition learning in adolescents with intellectual disabilities. And I'd like to acknowledge my team, because this really was a team effort, and I'm enormously grateful to all of them, because everybody worked hard to get this done, especially when COVID hit just at the end of data collection. And also our funder, the Baillie Thomas Charitable Fund. So today I've chosen some tree images to relax us all, because I think everybody needs that. And starting off with the background, Hebb repetition learning is a form of incidental learning, and it can occur when sequences of items are repeatedly presented in the same order. And Hebb learning reflects the gradual integration of the serial order information you're holding in short-term memory into a more stable and unified long-term memory trace. So how do we assess Hebb repetition learning? So you basically present an immediate serial recall task where you sneakily intersperse some sequences that are entirely repeated, and you mix them up with what's called filler sequences, which are all different as they would be in a normal immediate serial recall task. So on the image, the trials are shown from 1 to 12 at the bottom. So there would be 12 repeated sequences here, or Hebb trials, and possibly 12 or sometimes 24 of the blue trials, which would be filler trials, which are all different. And what you can see is that the differences in serial recall between Hebb and filler sequences that emerge over trials, they give us our assessment of Hebb learning. And the sequences maintained for this immediate recall, they contribute to the development of long-term memory traces. And in turn, the long-term memory trace helps improve immediate serial recall when these sequences are repeated. So what's the importance of Hebb repetition learning? So the core Hebb mechanism is thought to be relevant to the acquisition of vocabulary and reading, and quite a few people have made this suggestion. So what does it actually mean? Well, you can think of a new phonological word form as a sequence of sublexical units, and repeated exposure to these sublexical units allows the consolidation of that sequence into a more stable long-term memory trace. So it's like an analogy for word learning. This can also be used to understand reading. So repeated exposure to grapheme sequences operates in a similar manner. So you get long-term stable representations from repeated exposure to a certain grapheme sequence. So it's been argued that Hebb repetition learning draws on the same memory processes responsible for representing and learning serial order information in the service of language acquisition. And it's a fundamental learning mechanism for sequential knowledge, such as language. So turning now briefly to intellectual disability. Intellectual disability applies to those who have intellectual and adaptive functioning difficulties, and that's within conceptual, social, and practical domains. Now, there's an established literature on systems that support, for example, working memory in those with intellectual disability. And often that type of research is interpreted with respect to something known as the developmental approach. And this is really that the cognitive abilities of someone with ID would tend to follow the same pattern of development as typically developing peers, but at a slower rate and perhaps reaching a lower final asymptote. In terms of previous relevant findings about Hebb repetition learning in people with intellectual disabilities, I couldn't locate any, except for a paper by Moss and Gerald, and that looked at Hebb repetition learning in young people with Down syndrome and compared them to ability-matched children with typical development. Now, in this study, they didn't report any group differences in Hebb repetition learning, and that supported the developmental approach, although the immediate serial recall performance of the young people with Down syndrome was weaker. They also noted that preserved Hebb repetition learning could have important educational implications, so things like benefits of implicit approaches when presenting new information, as this may actually be taken in more readily by someone with a learning disability or an intellectual disability. So the current study investigated Hebb repetition learning in adolescents with intellectual disabilities, and we compared them to children with typical development, and they were all very closely matched for mental age. We pre-registered our study with the Open Science Framework, and the data and code will be made available after publication, which hopefully will be shortly. So what were the research questions? Well, we had two sets that I'd like to talk about today. And the first set concerned three different research questions. The first one was, do adolescents with intellectual disability and children with typical development matched for mental age both show Hebb repetition learning? Now, there's not much evidence in terms of participants with ID, so this was a little bit tentative, but we did predict they would show a Hebb learning effect. There's more evidence for typical children, so we were more confident that we would find that in our group with typical development. Next of all, are Hebb repetition learning effects of similar magnitude in the two groups? So based on a developmental approach, we predicted here comparable Hebb repetition learning in both groups. So in other words, the Hebb repetition learning should be consistent with mental age in those with ID. And then finally, are Hebb repetition learning effects present and of similar magnitude for both verbal and visuospatial materials? Now here we went on the Moss and Gerald findings and also some scattered literature on typical children and adults suggesting that they may be equivalent, but it's slightly tentative, this, because there's a bit of a mixed bag in terms of previous evidence here. So we had a sample of 47 adolescents with non-specific ID, and we actually made sure that we assessed both their cognitive abilities and their adaptive skills, so their daily living skills. And these were young people who had both cognitive and adaptive difficulties. We compared these adolescents with ID to a mental age matched comparison group. So these were younger children with typical development, and there were, again, 47 of those children. Here's a little more detail about our participants. The participants with ID came from a range of mainstream schools, and we asked schools to identify young people with an intellectual disability, and we then screened them. So the average age was 13, and it ranged from 11 to 15, so we went to secondary schools. The mental age was average 7 years, 1 month, and the IQ levels range from 47 to 79 with an average of 63. Adaptive functioning scores were somewhat higher, but we made sure that there was at least one score less than 80 on either the overall adaptive functioning measure or one of the subscales. Our TD children were 7-year-olds, and they were exactly matched for mental age. And these children had average scores on the Stanford Binet that we used for both groups. So how did we assess Hebb repetition learning? So as I mentioned at the beginning, it's usually measured using immediate serial recall tasks. So the current study did use an immediate serial recall measure, and we had two. One was a verbal task for words, and one was a visuospatial task for nonsense pictures. And as per the usual format, some of the to-be-remembered sequences are repeated, and those are known as Hebb trials, and other sequences are always novel, and these are known as filler trials. And again, we're looking for differences in serial recall that emerge between Hebb and filler sequences, and this indicates Hebb repetition learning. So including both verbal and visuospatial materials, we felt was an interesting question to address this issue of domain generality. If there is a Hebb repetition learning mechanism, is this something that is common across different types of modality, or could it be somewhat adjusted for one domain versus another? These are questions that unfortunately we can't answer in detail in this study, but we thought it would be interesting to assess for both verbal and visuospatial materials, given the background of these sorts of arguments. So our two Hebb tasks used pictures that were very like this. This just shows you 4 of the pictures from each task. So in the verbal task, we use pictures of early age of acquisition items with good, clear pictorial representations and agreement on what you call them. They were also all one-syllable names. And in the visuospatial task, we use nonsense pictures that were difficult to name. And these were produced for us by an artist, and they had to strike a balance between not being overly complex, but being difficult to name rapidly, which I hope we achieved. So the Hebb tasks were presented as an iPad game, and the game showed sequences of pictures one by one to the participant. And the instruction was just try to remember the pictures in the same order. Now, in the literature for adults, you often find that there are 2 filler trials for each Hebb trial, but with children, this is often done with 1 Hebb trial to 1 filler trial. So We actually used that method. So we just alternated between Hebb and filler trials. And on the Hebb trials, we were drawing from pools of either 8 visuospatial items or 10 verbal items. And this was the same sequence presented on every trial, and there were 8 Hebb trials. On the filler trials, there was a different pool of items, but they were very similar to the Hebb pools. And in fact, we swapped them over for a second go so that we made sure that there were no item specific or pool specific effects. And again, these are a different sequence of items presented on every trial, and there were 8 filler trials. Recall was all non-verbal to make sure we matched across the 2 tasks. The child pointed to the sequence of items in serial order, and they selected items from the full item pool in each case, and the item pool was presented in random order on each trial. I should also say that on the verbal trials, there was a voice over, so each picture was presented with the name of the item, and there was no voiceover, obviously, for the visuospatial. Oh, I forgot, I did some coloring and forgot to show you. Never mind. Okay, so this may or may not work. Let's have a go. What I want to show you is an example.
House.
Oh, here it goes.
Fish. Car. Ring. Chair. Kite.
Right, so hopefully that worked. It has a slight mind of its own, that thing, so I never quite know if it works or not. Anyway, that showed an example sequence from the verbal Hebb task at a list length of 6. So we worried greatly about the sensitivity of our measures. In the literature, you do see occasional reports of poor reliability for Hebb repetition tasks, and this worried us greatly, so we felt that the difficulty levels should be titrated to the child's short-term memory span for each of the materials. So participants were pre-tested to establish their baseline short-term memory for words. That's to establish what it was for the verbal task, and then nonsense pictures for the visuospatial task. And those with lower short-term memory scores were given somewhat easier Hebb tasks, so list lengths of 5 verbal items or 3 visuospatial items. And those with higher short-term memory scores had longer lists of 6 verbal items or 4 visuospatial items. And we checked that between the 2 groups, the numbers receiving each type of list length were almost identical. So that just happened, but it was a relief because it meant there weren't any clear group differences in who got which list length. So scoring was another area that exercised us because we wanted to make sure our scoring system was sensitive enough to pick up differences between participants. And to maximize sensitivity, we gave them 1 point for each item correctly recalled within a trial. So that's regardless of order. And they received an additional point for each item that was recalled in the correct order. Total scores per trial were converted into proportions correct because we had these different list lengths, and we administered the Hebb tasks twice, counterbalanced for order, and swapping over the pools of items for Hebb versus filler, and that was done in separate sessions. I'm just going to mention this exploratory scoring because Chris Gerald is here and he very helpfully had comments about this and it worked really well. So another way of scoring Hebb task is to use Levenstein edit distance metrics, and that really refers to the minimum number of edits needed to transform one string into another. So I don't want to go into that because I'm not going to give you those results, but basically the results were the same, and our scoring was highly correlated with these Levenstein distances. So we'll stick with the original scoring, and that was what we pre-registered. So the analysis method was to look at the data for each group separately. So we pulled over materials and used generalized linear mixed models, and that was per our pre-registration. Now, what we're looking for is a positive interaction effect between trial type, Hebb versus filler, and trial position 1 through 8. And as we've discussed, that indicates the degree of Hebb learning, and this helps us test the first two research questions as it captures our recall improvement over Hebb trials in comparison to filler trials. And then to test the differences between verbal and visuospatial materials, we pooled the data across group. So let's turn to the results for our first set of research questions. So I'm going to show you some graphs that present performance over the 8 Hebb trials and the 8 filler trials for each material and each group. So you've got trials 1 to 8 along the x-axis, and on the y-axis, you've got proportion correct. And that's our original item and position scoring. So if we look at research question 1, do adolescents with ID and children with TD match for mental age both show Hebb repetition learning effects? If you look at the ID group and the T group, it's pretty plain to see that both groups do indeed show these effects. So here, the interaction between trial type and trial position was significant in both groups. And that was research question 1. So that was a yes to our predicted Hebb repetition learning in both groups. For research question 2, we were concerned with whether the Hebb repetition learning effects were of similar magnitude when you compared the two groups. So if you look on the left at the ID group graphs and on the right, the TD group graphs, they do look broadly comparable, although there's a slight hint that, and it's a bit more obvious on the verbal items, that perhaps the ID group have a slightly smaller tendency towards a Hebb learning effect. Now, we pre-registered our approach to testing this hypothesis, which was to look at the credible intervals for the the trial type by list position or Hebb interaction. And these were just touching these 90% credible intervals. So we felt that there was no robust evidence that they differed between the groups, but we want to just raise the uncertainty that the evidence that they were overlapping was only just. And then finally, are the Hebb repetition effects present and of similar magnitude for both verbal and visuospatial materials? So the first part of that question is a yes. There were Hebb effects for both verbal and visuospatial effects. So if you look at the top 2 panels versus the bottom 2 panels, visually it's very obvious that the answer to the second part of that question was a no, because the Hebb effects were larger, considerably larger, for verbal versus visuospatial materials. And I've just noticed I've put the labels going down the side incorrectly there, so apologies for that typo. So in summary, we're showing Hebb repetition learning in both groups. They are broadly similar in magnitude, although I've alerted you to the fact that those credible intervals were only just touching. And the Hebb repetition learning was present for both verbal and visuospatial materials, but it was not comparable in magnitude. It was larger for the verbal materials. One other thing, this again was raised by a reviewer, and if we just go back to the graph for a minute, you can see that the Hebb learning effect appears to be flat or slightly improving, where the filler effect seems to be deteriorating in the verbal materials, and it's a bit less clear in the visuospatial materials. So I'd just like to run through some exploratory analyses we did to look at that in a bit more detail. So on the Hebb trials, for both groups and both types of materials, there was a significant increase in recall. So Hebb, the repetition of the Hebb item led to learning over trials. On the filler trials, for both groups with verbal material, we see a significant deterioration on the filler trials. However, on the visuospatial materials, we don't see a change in the filler trials. So they stay stable, they don't go up, they don't go down either. Now, I'm not going to say a huge amount about that, but we did feel that that could be explained by interference. So partial activation on filler trials builds up through trials 1 to 8, because you've got a lot of partially activated items or maybe small sequences of items. Now, we feel that that's not so relevant for the visuospatial materials because these are novel items and perhaps it's harder to keep them activated because they don't have sort of long-term memory input there. So it's possible that could be the case, but that's just speculation because our data can't really tell anything more specific. Okay, so overall, we found some support for the developmental approach, albeit with some uncertainty that our adolescents with non-specific ID were showing Hebb repetition learning commensurate with their mental age level. We've covered this issue that recall improved on Hebb trials, deteriorated on filler trials for verbal materials, but on visuospatial materials, the filler trials didn't deteriorate. And we wondered if that could be explained by interference. And then we've got Hebb repetition learning for visual and verbal materials, supporting a domain general argument, although we have to note the degree of Hebb repetition learning was greater for verbal materials. And despite our titration of difficulty level, we weren't entirely successful in matching our tasks for difficulty. So I think it's a little bit difficult to interpret those differences. So our second set of research questions were all about the relationships between Hebb repetition learning and language and literacy abilities. And we were looking at vocabulary, grammar, and word reading in both of our groups. And based on not a very extensive literature, certainly in children, and absolutely very little in children with ID, but we did predict positive relationships between Hebb repetition learning and measures of language and literacy in both of our groups, although we were prepared for them to be rather modest. We also wondered whether these relationships may be altered by including verbal short-term memory as an additional predictor. Now, this is because the Hebb repetition task is basically an immediate serial recall task. And it's of interest to see whether the Hebb repetition element, the long-term serial order mechanism, is different from the short-term memory element. And we've chosen verbal short-term memory because we felt this was of most relevance to language and literacy. So we predicted that actually, well, we hoped that Hebb repetition learning would still be a significant predictor of language and literacy, even after including verbal short-term memory. And that's based on the theoretical accounts and some previous literature, and views that Hebb repetition learning and verbal short-term memory are separate systems, and both may well be related to language and literacy. So the three measures we used were the British Picture Vocabulary Scale, and this is a measure of receptive vocabulary. We also used the test for reception of grammar, and this is a measure of receptive grammar. And we used the Towery, which is a measure of sight word reading and phonemic decoding. So our participants here, due to COVID, were somewhat different to the previous experiment. Most of them are the same, but COVID interfered with our final testing phase, and some of the assessments were not available for all participants. So we have ID and TD groups from the same mental age range, but here they're not matched exactly, because for this part of the study, we're looking at these groups separately, and group differences were not of direct interest. Now, we took this approach to maximize the sample size and ensure transparency. So basically, every participant within the correct mental age range who had the appropriate measures available was included here. So what were the results? So this slide's showing you just the simple correlations between Hebb repetition learning in blue and language and literacy. So there were some correlations. In the ID group, there was a correlation with vocabulary, and in the TD group, there were correlations with grammar and also with reading. Now, verbal short-term memory, as expected, correlated as well. And in fact, it correlated with all of our measures of language and literacy. So in both groups, all three of these abilities were correlated with verbal short-term memory. Interestingly, when we looked at whether Hebb repetition learning and verbal short-term memory were related to each other, they were not in the ID group, and they were in the TD group. So I don't really know how to explain that, but it was an interesting finding. So in our pre-registered regressions, we had said we would include 3 predictors for each of our outcome measures: vocabulary, grammar, and reading. And those predictors were mental age, Hebb repetition learning, and verbal short-term memory. However, with mental age included as a predictor, neither of those measures were significant additional predictors. So they don't do anything for us beyond mental age. But mental age did account for a substantial proportion of the variance in 5 of our 6 regressions, and in one case, 62%. So we ran exploratory regressions with just 2 predictors. So we took out mental age and just included Hebb repetition learning and verbal short-term memory. And for this, all 6 of the models were significant. So if we have a look at the exploratory regressions for our ID group and vocabulary, we see that both Hebb repetition learning and verbal short-term memory were both significant predictors of vocabulary, and they accounted for 24% of the variance in total. Grammar, well, there was no correlation in this group, so we didn't expect it to be a predictor, but again, it wasn't, but verbal short-term memory was. And for reading, neither measure were significant predictors, although verbal short-term memory kind of approached significance. In the TD group, neither measure was a predictor of vocabulary, but verbal short-term memory was significantly related to grammar. And then finally, in the TD group, Hebb repetition learning was a predictor of reading and verbal short-term memory wasn't. So we have two results that suggest that Hebb repetition learning as an additional predictor to verbal short-term memory is explaining some variance. And the one is in our TD group, and that's for reading, and the other is in our ID group, and that is for vocabulary. So with the correlations, Hebb repetition learning did to some extent relate to language and literacy, and that was focused on vocabulary in the ID group and grammar and reading in the TD group. And when we looked at two predictors of each of these outcome measures, there was a significant predictor for vocabulary, Hebb repetition learning, I should say, within the ID group. And in the TD group, Hebb repetition learning predicted reading, but it didn't predict grammar. So the hypothesized links between Hebb repetition learning, language and literacy were partly supported, and that does align with some limited previous literature, but these relationships were modest. And I must say that when we included mental age as a predictor, they were absent. However, if we think about possible educational implications, it would seem that using repetition within educational context could support vocabulary learning for adolescents with ID. There's been a recent survey study looking at strategies for consolidating science vocabulary in secondary school students, and this repetition is often used as a key strategy. For children with typical development, repetition may be more supportive of single word reading. I haven't had a great deal of thought about why that might be, but it could be something to do with the stage of reading that our children were at. These are 7-year-olds, so it may actually just be that at that point, they are finding the repetition of sequences of graphemes may actually be very helpful for learning. So I have finished a little bit early, but I look forward to the discussion, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Lucy. That was great, really interesting. There's already some questions. Oh, you're getting some applause, some virtual applause. There's already some questions in the chat. I know you can read them yourself, but I'm gonna read them out. So
I'd rather you read them because it's a little bit much to take in.
Okay. So the first one is from Chloe Marshall, who's asking, is there really, unless you want to say it out loud yourself, Chloe?
I'm very happy to say it out loud myself. I mean, I wrote this just before Lucy went back and sort of tried to address this issue, but it still worries me. I mean, I'm still not convinced that Hebb learning is really taking place, because when you look at your graphs, there's very little improvement between trial 1 and trial 8. What you seem to have is a different pattern of forgetting in the filler items.
Yeah, when I first saw them, I would agree with you, but the fact is that over sequences, the filler items are getting worse. Now, that I don't think we see in adult participants. It tends to be reasonably flat. But if that's something that's happening in typical children and children with ID, it suggests that, you know, whatever's going on, if it is interference, there's quite a lot of that happening. And it is always traditionally the gap between Hebb and filler performance that we're interested in. So that gap is there. Although I take your point that the improvements per se are, not as emphatic as perhaps we would see in an adult sample.
Can I follow that up by asking whether you've used this particular task with adults? I mean, would you get the predicted, increase for those Hebb items in adults?
Well, I haven't used our particular task with adults, but in the literature, it's more emphatic. So you do see an increase in the Hebb line going up and the filler line maintaining.
Sure, I'm just wondering if it's something to do with these particular items, or?
I think it could be to do with the age. Not everybody measures Hebb learning in exactly the same way. So it's not always possible to see the graphs. And there's just a lot less data from children available in the literature. But I will definitely look at that with a fine-tooth comb because it's a really, really interesting question.
Chris has a question. I don't know whether you wanted to ask it, Chris, or I only say that because I see your camera is on.
Yeah, I'm happy to hi, Lucy. Lovely talk, thanks. It links to what Chloe was saying. In our work, we've found very similar effects with young children, with individuals with Down syndrome, whereby the Hebb effect is sort of maintenance of performance and the filler lists drop off. And we interpreted that as fatigue effects in young folks, and sort of biased, but I'm like you, inclined to think that any difference still has to be explained by the repetition of the Hebb lists, and it still means something as a result. But I was really interested in what you were saying about interference effects, because we know there are interference effects when you get the same stimuli coming back at you. And the fact that you see that drop off of filler list for the verbal task, but not the visual task. And I remember that you had a longer list always for verbal as opposed to visual, for very good reasons. And then I wondered whether that might be consistent with that, right? I think it depends on your model of interference, but I think if you have more items in the list, you've got more room for interference to occur. And therefore it makes sense that you're getting more of that in the verbal than the visual. If it was just fatigue, which is what I thought about in the past, that would presumably be comparable across the two types of task. So sort of more a thought really than a question.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. And I hadn't thought of that. So that's really helpful. Thank you. The fatigue argument is also good. One of our reviewers really didn't like it. So we thought more about the interference. But I was struck, I'm absolutely hopeless at the visuospatial items. I'm really terrible. I find that task almost impossible. And I did wonder whether it is partial activation, because these can't be, these items being partially activated is no help because you don't have any kind of long-term representation of them. But obviously, yeah, the number of items as well is relevant. And the pool was slightly smaller, so you're choosing from slightly fewer items. So that may mitigate it a bit, but yes, it's a much shorter list.
Yeah, I wondered about that. I couldn't quite do the math, what kind of proportion of the pool you were getting each time, because that could also be a factor, right? Couldn't it? If you're getting a larger proportion of the pool, I think that would lead to greater interference effects, but you have different pool sizes.
It's not exactly the same. You're getting 3 or 4 items in a pool of 8, or 5 and 6 items out of a pool of 10. So there is a difference there. It's always problematic with measuring these sorts of skills in children. And I've wrestled with it for decades, literally, because you want to get a task where you give everybody the same list length. And actually with children, you just can't do that, because for some of them, it's ridiculously easy. And for some, it's just hopeless. And it's a well overspan. And that's why we did the titration. But being really honest with you all, the way of measuring Hebb repetition learning, it does need further thought and careful consideration about reliability, because our tasks were reasonably reliable and they're better than some in the literature, but some of the tasks that you see in the literature are really not very reliable. So when we come to look at individual differences, obviously if the task is not reliable, we are not finding any relationships with language and literacy. So, but yeah, there's a lot of unknowns there. And I absolutely love this task, but I don't claim to understand it really well yet.
There is, thanks Lucy, there's another question in the chat from Angel Tovar, who's saying we have a study with people with Down syndrome using a serial reaction time task similar to the HRL task. And people with Down syndrome showed preserved and impaired learning of sequences. Impaired learning was explained from interference effects. The interference effects were described with a computational model based on Hebbian learning. So there's the DOI has been given here.
Yeah, thank you. I wasn't aware of your study. I do apologize. I will look at it with great interest.
And then we have a question from Michael Thomas. Is repetition a better technique for teaching concrete declarative content and procedures for lower ability individuals, while variation is a better technique for more able children, or are the implications here restricted to learning disability?
Yeah, what I can't say is whether young people in the age range of 11 to 15 without a learning disability might find this useful as well, repetition, because we didn't have that sample in our study. I think all I can say is that for our typical children, there was no relationship between Hebb repetition, learning and vocabulary, but that did appear in our group with intellectual disabilities. It's a really interesting issue, but I don't feel very comfortable, speculating or drawing too many conclusions from our findings. So I hope that's not a very great answer, but it's a very good question with a sort of slightly poor answer.
Thanks, Lucy. We've got another question now from Tom. Oh, Michael says great. Another question from Tom. I wonder if you'd see differences between a static and dynamic stimuli. Could children preserve the order of events at recall, especially if it is something specifically interesting to them? For example, can they remember the order of events from a children's TV program? Maybe familiarity and interest explain an individual's ability to recall sequences.
Yeah, I've always felt that familiarity and interest are absolutely crucial, so I completely agree. And the point about static and dynamic stimuli is also really important. One of the worries I had about the visuospatial task is when I looked at the literature, some people use static visuospatial tasks and some people use dynamic. And I think we haven't explored whether that could actually cause differences, and it could be a relevant feature. So again, a lot of unknowns, but all of those points are really absolutely right. I'm sure it's all very relevant.
Thanks, Lucy. If anybody else has got a question, do stick your hand up or put it in the chat. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask a question. So the finding that neither verbal nor Hebb learning predicted reading in the ID group, is that correct? And I don't know much about dyslexia interventions, but I have been looking a lot at dyslexia lately because I'm looking at it from another perspective. Is that really, really surprising? That given that, isn't that a large part? Isn't repetition a large part of interventions for people with reading difficulties? Or am I really don't know.
I'm not sure. I thought reading interventions would be more about phonological skills and applying that to decoding. So understanding letter sound correspondences and the importance of sounds and discrimination between different phonemes, sort of rhyme awareness and onset rhyme and that type of thing.
Yeah, I understand.
Grapheme.
Yeah.
I I'm a little less convinced about how Hebb maps onto reading. I find it more convincing about how it maps onto phonological word form learning. But for the reading, the arguments go that you have an orthographic sequence, and that's repeated, and gradually that becomes a more stable long-term representation. So I can see that that maps onto the general idea of a long-term serial order mechanism. But personally, I'm just not quite so persuaded about how relevant that is for reading compared to learning words.
Okay, well, yeah, it was more, so I understand the phonics side of it, but it was more the repetition component. I was
Well,
I
I
was
suppose you would
surprised.
just assume that through reading, they come across certain items frequently, and those are better recalled and remembered and read. And the Towery is literally a list of words, and the child reads them. It's just single word reading, and the non-word reading is just single non-words, and you decode them. Excuse me.
So, okay, thanks. I mean, like I said, I honestly don't know much about remediation work with dyslexia. I was just
Sorry, I don't really know either. So
okay.
I apologize to anybody who's an expert.
Likewise. But we have another link here. From Chris. Yes, I'm saying Eleanor Small, Small, done some work on the links between HRL and reading. Great, thank you very much, Chris. Does anybody else have any questions for Lucy on this?
Can I ask one more question, Lucy? So I'm really interested in the second part of your talk, which I didn't know so well. That's that individual difference analysis. That's really cool. And I was just typing something into the chat at the crucial moment, and if you said it, I missed it. Your index of head repetition learning, because you hinted at this in an earlier response, right? That's a open question. How does one measure degree of head repetition learning? So apologies if you did say it, and I'm sure you did.
No, I didn't go into that. So it's very complicated. And Sebastian is the expert, but it's the residuals of the list type by trial position interaction. So they represent whether our participant showed Hebb repetition learning that was equal to, less than, or greater than the group average. And we've used those residuals combining over visuospatial and verbal materials as per our pre-registration. And we've taken them from the Levenstein distance scores because the original scoring produced a model that didn't appear to be stable enough for those residuals. And Sebastian can give you chapter and verse on all of the details, but that's basically what the individual differences measure is. So it's both visuospatial and verbal, which I find interesting because that would suggest, I mean, we haven't looked at it separately because we didn't say we would do that in the pre-registration. But of course, now I'm wishing we had said that because it would be interesting.
That sounds really cool. Really good way of doing it. Yeah, I have to think about that, but that sounds like a really clever way of doing
it. We've got a few minutes left. If anybody else has a question for Lucy, you can stick it in the chat or raise your hand. There is. Okay then. Well, if there are no other questions, I will just thank Lucy once again. Really, really great talk. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Yes, I'll do some applause. And a thank you in the chat as well. Do you have to head off, Lucy, or did you want to hang back?
No, I can hang back for a minute or two. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay then. Thank you everybody else for attending the talk and for your great questions. See ya. More thank yous in the chat, Lucy.
Thank you.
Just wait for these.
Thanks, Lucy. Great talk.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for coming. It's always lovely to see you.
My
and
pleasure.
you've always got amazing questions.
I'm not sure they're questions, right? They're just kind of comments because I don't think I disagree with anything you said.